there was an asterisk on this one about secular history. And I think I mentioned something about secular history that I thought was pertinent, and that is that what we're talking about in those definitions was written history, but that doesn't preclude the fact that there couldn't be participation of God in real history. And what I was showing you near the end of the hour last time, I've got to get a little bit closer to this. What I was showing you near the end of the hour last time is that there are some things that are in the Bible that indicate that God may be involved in history. This is a section from second Isaiah. Isaiah is in two parts. The second part deals with the prophet that was speaking to the people that just had returned from exile. And they had gotten out of exile because of the fact that Cyrus the Great, the Persian emperor, had defeated the Babylonians. And in that particular passage, the prophet is speaking for the Lord and says the Lord had anointed Cyrus to be his servant. In other words, God was in charge of what had happened here. Well, that prompts an awful lot of thought. People start to wonder, these are from the book of Chronicles also, about is God in charge of everything that is taking place in secular history? And you find some passages that are in the Bible that I think are kind of interesting that indicate, yes, we may like to think that we're able to do that, but the passages are rather to the point. There's an awful lot that we don't know. This is from Matthew. Here's one from Thessalonians, says about the same sort of thing, that God knows what goes on. We don't necessarily know. Here's from Isaiah again. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are my ways your ways, says the Lord. For as heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. Now, I brought that up because there's something that may come up later in the lesson today that I think is rather pertinent. But right now, I'd like to go back to the book of Genesis and point out something that I came across in the book of Genesis that fascinates me, and that is that if you read the book from the beginning to the end, there seems to be a tremendous amount of migration of the Israelites from Mesopotamia into Canaan into Egypt. And the book of Exodus talks about this coming out of Egypt. How did this all come about? What was actually happening here? Can we find out from secular history what might have happened, other than just to take it as we have it as biblical history? I'm going to read you some passages right now. This is what it says in Genesis 11. The first part of Genesis 11 talks about the fact that people want to build this tower. It says, come, let us go down there and confuse their tongues, that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from over the face of the earth, and they left off building the city. Therefore the name was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth, and from there the Lord scattered them over all the earth. That is up to verse 9. Verse 10 starts a bit differently. I'll tell you something about this particular verses, however, and that these were written by what we call the Yahwist writer. The Yahwist was writing approximately the time of David, around 1000 BC. And he is describing, when he's describing the Tower of Babel, he's describing an era in history that goes back to about 10,000 BC. Now that's just a guess. That's just a guess. They think that if there were a Tower of Babel, it would have been around 10,000 BC, because it would have come a couple of millennia after the flood. Most geologists think that the flood, which seemed to have encountered just about the whole earth, took place near the end of the last ice age, which ended around 12,000 BC, 12,500 BC. So if we put Babel at 1000 BC, that sounds about right. Here we have Babel at 1000 BC. What is being written is written by somebody at a period of 100 BC. Now, let me show you the next verses. You got those, memorize that if you can. Okay. What happens, all of a sudden, you go from verse 9 to verse 10, and you start getting this great, big, long list of names. One name after. What this is a list of the names, supposedly, of the descendants of Shem all the way down to Terah. Terah, the father of Abraham, all the way down to Terah. This is sometimes called the genealogy or the generations of man. This was not written by one of the sources. It was written by the redactor. Now, what's another name for a redactor? An editor. The editor that was editing and putting together the Bible, which we'll talk about rather extensively later this year, once in a while will try to connect two different verses and try to find one source connected with another source, and he'll use these connecting situations. Here he uses this connecting situation. Have you read all this? I tried adding up those names. I tried to gave up on that one. This is what we just read. Oh, this is from chapter 11. This goes to the next verse. After that long list of names, then we get these verses. Terah took Abraham, his son, and Lot, the son of Haran, and his grandson, and Sarah's daughter-in-law, his son Abraham's wife, and they went forth together from Ur of the Chaldeans to go to the land of Canaan. And when they came to Haran, they settled there. And the days of Terah were 205 years. Now, all of a sudden we go from where? 10,000 BC, the Tower of Babel. We put those intervening verses and we drop all the way down to the time of Terah. You know when that was? About 1800 AD BC. A period of about 9,000 years, maybe a little more than 9,000 years. What those intervening verses were is nothing more than a way of trying to connect two very different times and era into a single story. However, when you read this, there's a whole bunch of red flags that go up. There's some things about this that don't quite ring right. First of all, after finding out that Terah had lived, it was a descendant of people all the way back to Shem, and we get 9,000 years of his heritage, the first real action that we get out of Terah is what? The first real action is kind of interesting. All of the hereditary, all the heritage that he has in Mesopotamia, what's he going to do? He's going to leave it. Does that raise a question? Why? Why is he suddenly wanting to leave? This is one of the things that we're going to be looking at in the next week or so. But there are some other things that are quite interesting. That he went forth from Ur of the Chaldeans. Well, have you ever heard the name Ur before? Yes, that was a very famous city in a period that we'll talk about a little bit later on, the period of Sumer. This heir of Sumer had been destroyed about 400 years before Terah comes on the scene. It's been long gone. Where is this Ur? Well, you go to the internet and you'll find out there are a number of different places that call themselves Ur, because after all, what does the word Ur mean? City. It talks about the city of the Chaldeans. Now that helps us a lot. You know who the Chaldeans were? Nebuchadnezzar, Nabopolassar, and Evil Marta. These were the Babylonian kings that were kings of Babylon about the period of 650 to about 550. That's way out of taste. What are these Chaldeans doing in here? The reason this sounds this way, and I'll get back to this verse in just a moment. The reason this sounds this way, this was written about 500 BC. This was written by one of the priestly writers, and he had all this background to realize that there was no Ur of Sumer. It was Ur of the Chaldeans, Ur of the area of the Babylonian king. This doesn't make sense at all. You know, we're talking about, he knows, the author knows, the priestly writer knows that Terah came out of an area that had at one time been under the Babylonians. It came from a place called Ur. Well, later on in the lessons, we'll talk about that Ur rather extensively. But there's something more to this verse that's even more puzzling. This is the same thing. They went into the land of Canaan, when they came to Haran, they settled there. Now, why all of a sudden does he talk about Haran? Why does Haran? Haran is in upper Mesopotamia. And it turns out that Terah and Abraham at that time with Lot, they stopped at Haran and didn't go any further. Why mention Haran? Well, it says because, well, it doesn't, it says on the previous slide, because Terah stayed there the rest of his life. As a matter of fact, Haran became a rather significant part of Israel history. There are 12 tribes of Israel. 11 of those tribes have an ancestor that was born in Haran, or a grandfather that was born in Haran. These tribes, in a sense, had emanated from Haran. Haran was very sick. Where is Haran? Way up north. Who went to Haran and had all these kids? That was Jacob. That's where Jacob met his wives, Rachel and Leah. That's where he had these concubines. That's where he had all these children. But even more surprising, it makes mention of the fact that they were on their way to Canaan. Why bother to tell where you were planning to go if you didn't go there? As we go through the history, you'll find out it was very significant that Terah had planned with Abraham to go to Canaan. You know why? Because everybody else was. It was the thing to do to go to Canaan. Now that brings up the question, why were so many of these people wanting to leave Mesopotamia and go somewhere else? We'll have to talk about that next week. We'll talk about it rather extensively. And why, of all places, did they go to Canaan? When I was going through this, I was remembering something I was talking about, go to Canaan. It says something. I'm going to do something. I'm going to go somewhere. When I was a kid, growing up after World War II, I'll get this right, after World War II, one of the things that was kind of interesting among the older gentlemen in the community living up in Michigan, guess what you're going to do? What are you going to do when winter comes? I'm going to go to Florida. They didn't say, where in Florida? I'm going to go to Florida. It's sometimes Fort Lauderdale, sometimes St. Petersburg. I'm going to go to Florida. The same thing was true with this idea of Canaan. A lot of these Mesopotamians at that time had a feeling, I've got to get out of Mesopotamia. A lot of these people in Mesopotamia had to get out of Mesopotamia and go somewhere else. And the place they chose was Canaan. Next week we'll talk a little bit more about that Canaan in that regard. It's kind of interesting to take a look at these periods that we're talking about. That period between the Tower of Babel and the time of Terah is just about 10,000 years. What do we know about the history of that period from what we get from the Bible? Nothing. Nothing at all. I think I did put a slide in here. If I didn't, I should have. And that is going back to that idea, the inerrant interpretation of the Bible, that the Bible can have no wrong. Everything in the Bible is correct. There's another aspect to this that's equally important. The Bible may be free of error, but there is another thing. If it's not in the Bible, it's not significant. And it was just as easy as not for most people at that time, before the period of enlightenment, when they were living by this idea of an inerrant Bible. Well, if we don't know what happened between 10,000 BC and 1800 BC, who really cares? It's not in the Bible. Well, guess what? When you take a look at that verse, those verses that I just mentioned, it apparently was rather important as far as that priestly writer was concerned, because he knew that there was some history that had taken place that prompted what? Prompted Terah to leave and prompted him to go to Canaan. What do we know about that history? From the Bible, nothing. Do we know anything about that from another standpoint? You remember I mentioned last week that the 1800s were rather significant in terms of trying to understand, or in terms of Bible criticism, or in terms of interpreting the Bible. And one of them dealt with the documentary hypothesis. I just mentioned a little bit of that when I mentioned about the priestly writer and the Yahwehs. Those are part of the documentary hypothesis. The other part was the invention of modern archaeology. I don't know if I defined that to you last week, but my definition of modern archaeology, it is something that started in the 1800s. It wasn't that there weren't people that were interested in the past. because there had been almost since the beginning of time a group of people that considered themselves as archaeologists, but actually were what? Grave robbers. People would go to old graves, get what they could, and leave it behind. In the 1800s, people began to be a little bit concerned about having something from way back in the past and asking yourselves, to whom does this belong? What was going on when this thing actually existed? By the time we get to the New Testament, or by the time we get to the 1800s, things have started to progress. Now, you don't have to memorize all this, but here is, I'm sorry, I tried to find a better table than this. What we find is that between the period of 10,000 BC and 1200 BC, a period of 9,000 years that have been divided by archaeologists into different ages or different periods. Now, this slide doesn't show it quite as well as it should, but the important thing is that we have a Stone Age and we have a Bronze Age. These are very important areas. I'm going to take a look at the next slide, even though it's not as good a slide as I would like. And take a look at these ages and what they might mean. The oldest of the ages is called a Paleolithic. Paleo means ancient. What does lithic mean? Stone. Ancient Stone Age. From about 53,000 BC to about 10,000 BC, about the only thing that we have that remains that people used were made of stone. Was it the only thing they used? No, it was the only thing that was left. Everything else had deteriorated. They probably used bones, they probably used leather, they probably used wood a lot, but all of that was gone. The only thing that remained was stone. And up until about 1000 BC, the only artifacts that the archaeologists could come up with are stone, and so we refer to the Stone Age. The next age is actually this one here. This should be combined a little bit. The Neolithic Age. The Neolithic Age is the new Stone Age. The difference of the Neolithic Age is that was when things started to change as far as man being a gatherer and hunter and started to settle down and started to participate in his own agriculture and started to raise grain himself. That is followed by the Chalcolithic Age, which means copper, and bronze means bronze. But I've got some other slides that are a little bit better in that regard. Paleolithic Age, a rather long period. The only thing that remains are things from stone. The Neolithic Age, however, things are starting to change. People are settling down a little bit. But you want to notice something. They've got thatch huts that they're living in, and they are usually still stone. They're still use those stone for walls, but they're settling down. The reason that we know there is an accumulation of these artifacts all in one place, indicating that people had stayed there for some period of time, indicating that probably they were engaged in agriculture. Oh boy, what did I do now? After that comes the Pottery Age. Actually, there is a pre-Pottery Age. The interesting thing about the pre-Pottery Age is there wasn't anything they could hold in their hands. You know why? They hadn't learned how to fire pottery to make it last. The Pottery Age came around 5000 BC when man learned how to fire these clay objects and make them last. How long? Forever. And as a matter of fact, that Pottery Age, which is about 5000 BC, is extremely important as far as the archaeologists are concerned, because you could hold these pieces of pottery in your hand, and this pottery would vary from 1 year to the next, or one eon to the next, or one millennium to the next. I gave an illustration of the importance of pottery in that regard, is that it cannot be destroyed. You cannot be burned or anything like that. And to show you how they can make use of this, in my own mind I came up with an idea, and that is, supposing your grandmother's house burned right down to the ground, and you had a chance to go through the ashes, about the only thing that you would find are the dishes that did not get burned. Everything else is burned. And when you look at those dishes, you say, oh, that's what we used in Thanksgiving in 1940. You could almost date them for the style And from the paintings that you had on the dishes, the same thing was true with pottery. And for a long time, this was the major means of telling when certain things might have existed, was by looking at the pottery. Next is called the Chalcolithic. Chalco means copper. Chalcolithic means that they had discovered the use of metal, or of how to get metal. They found out how to heat copper ore so the copper metal would come out. And they used the copper metal. It was not all that useful, because copper was not a useful metal, except probably for decorations and things of this sort. This Chalcolithic age didn't last too long, because one of the things they learned to do with copper is to alloy it with tin and changed it into bronze. And bronze was a very useful metal. Bronze was a very strong metal. It could be used for making tools. It could be used for armor, for swords. And it was, as a matter of fact, it was so useful that this Bronze Age lasted for a long time. If you go back to one of the previous slides, you find out you have an early bronze, a middle bronze, and a late bronze, and they are even broken up in the Bronze Age lasted for a long time. There's actually evidence in the book of Samuel of the fact that the next age came up, and that the next age was the Iron Age. And we get a little section in the book of Samuel where we find out that the Israelites were not able to get any help in fashioning things out of iron, because the ironsmiths working with iron was relegated to the Philistines and a few other. As a matter of fact, the only people in those armies at that time that had iron or steel swords were Jonathan and Saul. The rest of them all had to deal with bronze. But we won't go any further back than that. That Bronze Age was a very significant age, and one of the things that was happening in the Bronze Age, and maybe just a little bit before that, is the evidence of the fact that in the lower part of Mesopotamia, first of all, let's talk about what Mesopotamia means. Does anybody know what Mesopotamia means? Between the two rivers, here's the Euphrates and the Tigris River. This is Mesopotamia. This is the area of Mesopotamia. Down in the southern part of Mesopotamia was a group of people who we refer to as the Sumerians. This was a place that we call Sumer. It was one of the first places where we see some real organization of society. In the province of Sumer, there's some very significant cities. I think I mentioned one of them before. The city of Ur was a very significant place, to say the very least. Ur is right here, right next to the Euphrates River. Uruk was also an important one, as was Kish. These are the important provinces, some of the important provinces. I added a couple of maps. I want to look at this map here. You notice that the Tigris and Euphrates River join before they flow into the Persian Gulf. I got some older maps, and you'll find out that Ur is right on the Persian Gulf. It was over a period of years that apparently those rivers combined and deposited a whole lot of silt and marshland in this area, and it became filled. I guess even to this day, in certain parts of the year, you can actually walk across that area. Where did all that marshland come from? Well, we'll talk about that in a moment as to one of the ideas that has been postulated. Here's another picture. Again, it shows Ur, very near the Persian Gulf here, a very important, significant city. The thing that was significant about the people in Sumer is the contributions that they made because of the fact that they were living in a rather organized society. This is just a little bit of some of the things. The writing I'll talk about in just a moment, but we find out that they made great use of the wheel. They didn't invent the wheel, but they were the first ones to put it on a chariot and made it quite useful in that regard. They were also the ones that invented the plow. They could do that because they now had bronze. They had something that was strong enough that would turn over the dirt, and they found out that, hey, you can throw seed on the ground, but it doesn't grow as well as if the ground was turned over. They invented the plow. They also invented irrigation. Irrigation doing what? Recognized that if anything was going to grow in that area, it had to be watered. They were living in pretty much of a desert area, but they had these two great rivers flowing right by them. Here are some pictures of what it might look like at that time. Here are people plowing. Right nearby, you see some water. I think I have another slide that's a little bit better. You see the irrigation ditches here. And in the background, you see something else. Canals. You see canals. They found out that water was very useful as far as transportation was concerned. So they built canals that did a lot of irrigating, taking water, taking land, and doing what? Allowing it to flow down. It probably was what filled up that part of the Persian Gulf. And that's why those two rivers eventually, one of the theories I read somewhere, and I'll tell you something, when you read something, you want to write it down and get the reference right away because you'll never find it again. I can't find where I read this, but that it indicated that very likely what had happened is that they were not only taking so much land and throwing it into those rivers, but they were taking the water from the rivers, and the level of the rivers went down, and it eventually reached the point where they were bound together. But this irrigation and the canals were a rather significant part of that situation with the people in Sumer. Here we found out something rather interesting, that the wheel as a means of transportation came after it was used for something else. Anyone want to guess what it was used for? A potter's wheel. They found out that there was some value in having a wheel turning around and working with pottery. Some of you may work with it with the potter's wheel. This was also rather important as far as the people in Sumer was concerned, because they made an industry out of pottery. And eventually they get the idea of using the wheel for transportation. They had another thing that they did that was very significant. They learned how to make mud brick, how to take mud and combine it with enough straw and then let it dry in the sun and so it become hard enough. And so the people in Sumer had the ability to make buildings not out of wood or not out of thatch or anything like that, but out of brick, out of mud brick. And all of a sudden buildings started showing up in Sumer, in these different towns. Does anybody make use of that today? What do we call it today? Adobe. They still do the same sort of thing in different parts of the world. But the people in Sumer were very adept at this sort of thing. They had gotten so advanced that it was really quite interesting. They were able to take care of what would have been their immediate needs. Their immediate needs were to make sure that they had enough food to live on. And by getting involved in irrigation and getting involved in plowing and getting involved in harvesting and probably domesticating animals, it wasn't long before they had the ability to take care of themselves. And when they had enough time to take care of themselves, they started thinking about other things. And then we find that the Sumerians started to make some contributions that were rather significant, to say the very least. I mentioned the plow. They got involved in math and science. Now, I don't want to go too far into this. We have a decimal system, pretty much based on what? We got 10 fingers and all that. They had a sexmal system, S-E-X-M-O. Don't get the wrong impression. Sexmal, based on 6 or based on 60. The reason being that 6 was a very interesting number as far as they were concerned for a number of reasons. It's fun to read about this, I won't go into it, but for example, the number 6 can be arrived at in different ways. You can have 4 and 2, you can have 2 and 3 and 3, you can get 6 that way. You go a little bit further, you go to 60. You can do a lot with 60 as well. You go even further than that. They figured out that if we have a perfect circle, there are 360 equal arcs in that circle, or what we call what? Degrees. The number 60 is rather useful in that it is so easily divided by some real whole numbers. A half of 60 is 30. Okay, that's easy enough. Well, I'll take it to another place. What do you think would happen if you went to your grocer and told him you wanted 10 eggs? What would he tell you to do? Go somewhere else. You buy them how? By the dozen, or what? A half a dozen. Immediately, you know, it's surprising how much that decimal or hexamal system has filtered itself down into our lives today. And this whole business of degrees, the 360 degrees in a circle, is very, very significant as far as people that are involved in trigonometry or any parts of mathematics. And unless you're using a digital clock, what is also true about the face of your clock, it's in terms of minutes and how many are there in one revolution, 60. And what can you do with that 60 minutes? Divide it in half. It's a very useful number. And like I say, it lasted to this day. I'm running low on time. They also invented writing. Now that may be one of the, often is mentioned as one of the more significant things that the Sumerians, the people in Sumer gave us, the ability to write. Now they may not have been the only ones that are doing this, but they think around 3,300 BC, around in that era, the Sumerians developed this method of writing. It may have been about the same time that the Egyptians had devised a method of writing using hieroglyphics. We'll talk about another. Actually, I find out that when you look at the things in the Far East, in India and China, they may have invented writing too, but we don't know that much about it. But as far as the people in Sumer, this became rather significant. It became significant because of the method they used for writing. They used what they call cuneiform writing. Cuneiform was made by taking a clay tablet with this stylus that has a little shape of a wedge, and by making little impressions on that clay with that wedge, and those impressions would stand for certain symbols that would stand for, well, have certain meanings, maybe letters. Actually, they did not invent letters yet. That came a bit later. But they were able to communicate in this fashion. The significance of those clay tablets was that you could so easily imprint things on that clay. And then if you left it out in the sun, guess what would happen? It would get baked. And guess how long it would last? It would last forever. And so what we find is as far back as 330 BC, or maybe even before that, people are writing things down that pertain to the things that may have been happening at the time they were writing this down. Does that sound significant? Very much so. I was told, and I wouldn't be a bit surprised, that when you take a look at these tablets, you're going to find out that most of them are going to be the same thing. You know what that is? Business transactions. They would record business transactions. If that were being done today, cuneiform, guess what it would be? All the material that you run into, you will go to the hospital with all the doctors and all the things that you have, paper that's involved. Have you ever looked at how much paper is involved in our society today? Apparently, even way back, the Sumerians were making use of the fact that they could keep records in this fashion. Now, this business of being able to write things down and record things about things that were happening at a given period of time and have that last truly proved to be rather significant as far as archaeology is concerned. This is just a little bit of what one of those tablets would look like, but it involves the name Ashurbanipal. Now, who was Ashurbanipal? I don't think I don't have one here. You find out that Ashurbanipal was one of the Assyrian emperors. He was the grandson of Sennacherib. Sennacherib was the emperor, the Assyrian emperor that laid siege on Jerusalem, but had to leave. Sennacherib went back to Nineveh, which was the capital of Assyria, and he was killed. His son, Esarhaddon took over the reins of that empire and brought it to its very peak. Esarhaddon actually took the Assyrian Empire way down into Egypt, and they're way down the Nile River. He became out by far the most successful of all these emperors. When he died, He was followed by his son Ashurbanipal. Ashurbanipal, well, let me give you an illustration of what he was like. Remember King David and the success that he had? He was followed by Solomon. And what was Solomon able to do? Spend all the money that David had made and result in the dissolving of the kingdom. Solomon was very successful in some regards, but not as successful as David was. The same thing was true here with this Esarhaddon. He was very successful as an emperor, but his son, Ashurbanipal, lived for a long time and spent an awful lot of money. And apparently one of his hobbies was these stone tablets. These stone tablets that were lying around all over Babylon, that whole area that was Babylon. And I think I have a picture, not of his library. I have a picture here. I'll get the right. No, I want to get back. There's a picture I want. That's a picture of his palace. The library must have been rather elaborate, to say the very least. But in that library, he collected as many of these particular things that he could possibly find. Here is a part of that Ashurbanipal library. And look at all of those tablets, all from the past that he found, that were found and brought to him, I would say, as part of his hobby. This royal library of Ashurbanipal had all of these tablets of clay. And even though Nineveh was destroyed by the Babylonians, it didn't touch the library. If it had, it wouldn't have made a difference, because you couldn't have burned those things. They were still there. Nineveh was destroyed around 611 BC. And we don't hear too much more about Nineveh again until about 1849 AD. Now that's a long time ago. That's about 200 years ago. One of the British explorers, a very, very diligent guy by the name of Layard, Austin Henry Layard, I think I have a picture of him. Austin, no. Here's Austin Henry Layard.
Earl,
Yes.
in that library, it talked about numerous languages that were on various stone tablets. You know how many were there?
I'm going to get to language quite a bit next week,
Okay.
when we find out what happened with Akkad and Akkadian language. Some of it was in Sumerian. Well, as a matter of fact, you brought up a good point. One of the things that, in addition to those business transactions and certain history, these people in Sumer had enough time to write novels. And you know what novel they wrote? The Gilgamesh Epic. The Gilgamesh Epic comes out of that period, and so they actually were able to get into what you might say some rather more artistic aspects of this. But I got to get close now. I cannot even see this. Here, Layard got a lot of honors during his lifetime. This is when his beard was comparatively short. I want you to take a look at the statement that's made near the bottom here. H.G. Wells, a British historian and a British writer, says the following: the Ashurbanipal Library gives modern historians information regarding the people of ancient Near East. In his outline of history, H.G. Wells calls the library the most precious source of historical material in the world. The reason for believing that, because when they discovered that library, they shipped most of it to London. So they had the tablets in London. You know how many there were? Between 20 and 30,000. They have not all been read that I'm aware of, but it gave fodder for a lot of people for a long time to study these, to find out as much as they possibly could about the history of what went on in the world at that particular time. Next week, we're going to look a little bit more thoroughly at that history that they were able to get from these things. What I want to do with you now, however, is to point out that Sumer is sort of regarded as the cradle of Western civilization. Why is it the cradle of Western civilization? Well, partly because we have all this record in this library. And because, after all, they were a very ingenious people, because they had enough time to do more than just to farm, but they could actually write about things. They could study new things. A very advanced people. What we're going to find out next week is that they soon disappeared. They were gone. The question is, what happened to them? Well, the Bible doesn't tell us that. Actually, some of the Sumerian history doesn't tell us, but some of the things that were in those tablets that were in the Ashurbanipal library does give us a bit of a record of what was going on in the world at that particular time. And it was kind of interesting that we find that this great idea of a special part of the world as being the cradle of civilization is one that we like to hang on to and say, okay, this is where it all got started because of the fact that man had developed the ability to think well enough to be able to write. Now, with the 10 minutes or so that I got left, I want to get into something a little bit different. What I want to get into is this, that around 1994, I guess it was, there was a farmer in southeastern Turkey who was working in his field, and he came across a stone which bothered him. And he wanted that stone out of the way, and so he started digging and tried to get that stone. I found out that he couldn't get to the bottom of the stone to dig it out. It wasn't long before he realized, hey, this wasn't just a rock. And immediately got the proper people involved. He went to some archaeologists and says, you better find out what this particular stone was. It turned out that, a few decades before that, there had been people that had been exploring that area, and they thought that, hey, this might have been a graveyard during the Byzantine era. But when they got in there and started digging, they came across something that was rather significant, much more than what they had expected. They came across a thing that we call Göbekli Tepe. It's a neological, it's a Neolithic archaeological site near the city, well, I mentioned the city in Turkey. Due to the pre-pottery Neolithic, this site had to be close to 8,000 to 10,000 years old, older than Stonehenge and older than Sumer by about 3,000 or 4,000 years. A long, well, let's take a look. Here is the area that we're talking about. Here is Sumer down here. You notice how this is all filled in. This is the area where this Göbekli Tepe is found, right around in this area here. And I was not able to find a photograph. Like, this is a real photograph. Look at the size of those stones that they found. And look at, these are stones that are piled on top of each other as well. I have a drawing that gives you an idea of how big this actually was, where the size of men. Looking at what they have found up to this point indicates that there was some sort of a circular system here, and that these rocks that we're looking at, like, well, look, here's the size of a man, how tall are these things, and how did they get this big thing on the top? This was back during the time, according to the old archaeological system, guess what? People were still doing what? Hunting and gathering. And they didn't have tools to do this sort of thing. They didn't have the wherewithal to be able to put one rock on top of another one in this fashion. And not only that, when they go into this far enough, you remember watching very quickly, there was a picture, it showed that there were a lot of carvings. and actually some inscriptions on some of these stones that indicated whoever these people were able to make these sort of carvings. There may be some indication there might even have been something that resembled writing. We don't know. Now keep in mind, this is about, 5,000 years after Sumer, before Sumer. Sumer doesn't come till about 5,000 years later. How long is 5,000 years? Well, between now and Sumer is 5,000 years. We think of that as being real prehistoric. We got to go back another 5,000 years. Some people have dated this through carbon-14 dating as far back as maybe about 1200 BC. A long time back. You got any questions? Let me tell you something else I came across. I remember reading a couple years ago that when they were first digging this stuff up, they were amazed at what they were finding, and also amazed at the fact that at that time, about 4 years ago, they figured that they had uncovered at about maybe 10%, and 90% of it was still under the ground. I wanted to check on that and found out if that was still true today, and it is not. Now they figure they have uncovered 5%, and 95% of it is still underground. What is there? Who knows? Who knows? Who were these people? What relationship do they have to what we have in the Bible? Is it all right to ask questions? Yeah, there are a lot of questions that have to be. I'd like to be around for a long time to find out what more they're going to find out down about that area. One of the curious things is that it appears that everything that they have here shows absolutely no signs of any human being. In this regard, no graves. They don't find any graves, any grave sites or anything like that. And apparently everything that they have found up to this point centers around some sort of like Stonehenge. What was Stonehenge all about? It was a place of worship. This may have been a place of worship. There are a lot of things that we don't know and we don't understand. Remember some of those first slides I was showing at the beginning of the hour? How when we go to the Old Testament, the New Testament, we do read about God using Cyrus as a servant. But it is also made very clear in Thessalonians and in Matthew and in Isaiah that we don't know everything. There are a lot of things that we don't understand. And as a matter of fact, I think Jesus makes it very clear that only the Father knows these things. There are many things that we have yet to know. I'm very curious about all of our ideas concerning how important Sumer was. What was going on long before that, and who were these people, and what contribution did they or did they not make, and whatever happened to them. I'm finding out in studying the Bible that I was hoping to be able to learn more about what was in the Bible, but I'm ending up with far more questions than I ever started out with. There are far more things that are harder to understand and all that. But one of the things that I hope to be able to show you in the next week or so is that how, with the archaeology that we do have available, we can take a look at that story that we have in Genesis of these people starting out in Mesopotamia, going into Canaan, and then going and actually ending up in Egypt. And by the time we get to the end of the book of Genesis, these Semitic people that started out as descendants of Noah, living in Mesopotamia, are now living in Egypt. The end. I'll run out of voice. Any questions?
It's interesting, Earl, that those eras in history are based on materials. In other words, they've chosen Stone Age, Copper Age, Bronze Age,
Yeah.
Iron Age. So it's based on materials, which is, I've got a little background in materials, which is corrosion. It's interesting to me that that's classification, is the importance of materials.
Yes,
in
yes,
yeah.
yeah. Well, copper was very easy to smelt out, apparently, but they couldn't find any real use for it until they alloyed it with tin. I don't even know how alloys work. but it changed copper into something that was very, very useful for a long time. And that was followed by the Iron Age. But the Iron Age actually gets us into Old Testament era. And as I mentioned before, in the book of Samuel, we actually get some indication that people were starting to use iron and thinking about iron instead of using bronze. But otherwise, all the battles that David probably fought were always done with bronze swords and spears and all that. Iron came later. The preservation of that library, I find rather interesting, that statement made by Wells, because in a sense this was very true, that the information that we got out of that Ashurbanipal library is very significant, as you'll find out next week when we talk about what really probably did happen and has been recorded. An awful lot of. How important is this? What was one of the most important discoveries that we had in the 20th century? The Dead Sea Scrolls. Again, it's getting some writings that we're able to look at things that we know when they were written. What I keep wondering about is when you get to Göbekli Tepe, if somebody might uncover a library down there and tell us an awful lot. Maybe we'll find out more in the future. We don't know. We don't know what's going to happen.
Where would the library be today? What country?
When is what?
What country?
It says in England.
In England?
The library went to England, right?
Oh, the scroll, the tablets went to London. Yes,
Yeah.
I think they're in the British Museum. Yeah, yeah, and
And where is this today?
yeah.
What country is getting
And,
it?
Turkey,
Turkey. Southeastern Turkey.
But Layard got all the acclaim that he should have. Actually, when you go through his whole life, he found very significant things. He was early on in exploring. In the history of archaeology, actually the history of archaeology in the 1800s really doesn't start until about 1840. Does anybody know what happened in 1840? A guy by the name of Robinson, with his traveling companion, did something you'd say is not all that profound. He and a traveling companion took a walking tour through Palestine to find out if any of the cities that were in Palestine in 1840 corresponded to cities that are mentioned in the Bible. And he did find many of them. Did find it became a very significant thing, that walk of Robinson. And in a sense, that was somewhat the beginning of the of biblical archaeology. That was almost simultaneous with the discovery by Schliemann. Does anybody know who Schliemann was? He was a German industrialist who took it upon himself to see if he could find the city of Troy, the ancient city of Troy. And he apparently did where Troy actually existed. So all of a sudden, archaeology starts blossoming around the mid-1800s. This finding of that library was absolutely has to be one of the more significant things that happened in terms of our understanding anything about the history of the ancient world. Next week, then, we're going to go further into that period. We're going to take a look at what happened to Sumer and why it happened to Sumer and what happened after that and why we can talk about things like the that Abraham had come from and where Abraham may actually have come from or where Terah may actually have come from. And talk about another whole group of people that play a very significant role in the history of the Israelites. And by that time, I'll get my voice back to you.